Riverside Diner, Interstate 40, Oklahoma, March 2018. The truck stop was the kind of place where long-haul drivers grabbed coffee at 3 a.m. and nobody asked questions about why you looked tired or what you were running from. Sarah Mitchell, a waitress who'd worked the graveyard shift for 11 years, had seen it all. Truckers sleeping in their cabs, families driving through the night to make it to funerals, runaways trying to look older than 16. But she'd never seen a 12-year-old girl walk up to a table of bikers, lean in close to the biggest one, and whisper something that made a 6'4" former Marine go completely still before his face transformed into something that scared even Sarah. The girl's words were barely audible, but Sarah caught them from 6 feet away because the diner had gone quiet, in that weird way places do right before something significant happens. My stepfather came into my room at night. He said if I told anyone, he'd hurt my mom. Please help me. What happened in the next 18 hours would involve 3 states, 2 police departments, the FBI, and a motorcycle club that operated by a code most people didn't know existed. It would also expose a trafficking operation that had been hiding in plain sight for 6 years. If you value stories about people who act when action matters most, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts of courage that changed lives. Emma Rodriguez had been traveling with her mother and stepfather for 3 days, driving from El Paso toward Tulsa in a conversion van that smelled like cigarettes and something else she couldn't identify but made her stomach hurt. Her mother, Diane, sat in the passenger seat staring out the window with that blank expression she'd been wearing for the past 8 months. Ever since she'd married Carl Brennan in a quick courthouse ceremony that Emma hadn't wanted to attend. Carl had seemed nice enough at first. He'd bought Diane flowers, taken them to decent restaurants, told Emma she was pretty in a way that had felt a little off, but that her mother said was just him being kind. The marriage happened fast, too fast, but Diane had been lonely since Emma's father died 4 years earlier, and Carl had been persistent in a way that Diane mistook for devotion. The change started 2 months after the wedding. Carl began making comments about Emma's appearance, asking her to wear certain clothes, telling her she looked mature for 12. Diane worked evenings at a hotel front desk, and Carl started volunteering to stay home with Emma instead of letting her go to her grandmother's like she used to. Emma told her mother she'd rather go to Grandma's house, but Carl convinced Diane it was important for them to bond as a family. The first time Carl came into Emma's room at night, she was reading in bed. He sat on the edge of her mattress and started rubbing her back, saying she looked tense, that he was just trying to help her relax. Emma had frozen, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, but Carl kept talking in that calm voice about how this was normal, how stepfathers helped their daughters feel better, how she shouldn't make it weird by telling her mom because Diane wouldn't understand. It escalated over the following months. Carl's nighttime visits became routine, his touching became more invasive, his threats became more explicit. If Emma told her mother, Carl said he'd make sure Diane knew it was Emma's fault, that Emma had been flirting with him, that no one would believe a kid over an adult. And if that didn't work, Carl said very quietly one night while his hand was somewhere it should never be, he'd hurt Diane. Maybe make it look like an accident. Maybe just disappear and take Emma with him because he had friends who knew how to make people vanish. Emma believed him. Carl had been in prison before, something Diane either didn't know or chose to ignore. He had tattoos that Emma later learned were associated with white supremacist gangs. He kept a gun in the van's center console and another one in a lockbox under the driver's seat. And he had friends who came to the house sometimes, men who looked at Emma in ways that made her skin crawl. Men Carl talked to in low voices about opportunities and merchandise. The trip to Tulsa was supposedly to visit Carl's brother, but Emma had overheard enough whispered phone conversations to understand something else was happening. Carl kept telling someone on the phone that the package would be ready for delivery and that she's the right age, matches what they're looking for. Emma didn't fully understand what he meant, but she understood enough to be terrified. They'd stopped at the Riverside Diner around 10 p.m. on their third night of driving. Diane went to the bathroom while Carl paid for gas. Emma sat in the booth they'd been assigned, desperately trying to figure out what to do. She'd tried to call her grandmother twice during the trip, but Carl had taken her phone, saying she didn't need distractions. She'd thought about running, but they were in the middle of nowhere, and Carl had made it very clear what would happen if she tried. Then she saw them. 6 bikers at a corner table, leather vests with patches she didn't recognize, talking and laughing over coffee and pie. One of them, the biggest guy with a grey beard and kind eyes, reminded her of her grandfather, who died when she was 7. Her grandfather had been safe. He'd never looked at her the wrong way, or made her feel scared. Emma made a decision driven by pure desperation. She stood up, walked over to their table while her hands shook so badly she had to clench them into fists, and leaned toward the big biker who looked like her grandfather. The words came out in a rush, barely above a whisper, but clear enough. "My stepfather came into my room at night. He said if I told anyone, he'd hurt my mom. Please help me." The biker's name was Robert Bear Morrison, a 47-year-old former Marine who'd done 3 tours in Iraq and now worked as a foreman at a construction company in Oklahoma City. He was president of the Steel Riders MC, a veteran motorcycle club that wasn't affiliated with outlaw gangs, but operated by a strict code of honor that included absolute zero tolerance for anyone who hurt children or women. Bear had 6 kids of his own, ranging from 24 down to 9 years old. He'd been trained to recognize distress signals in civilian populations during his military service, and he'd been briefed by FBI contacts about trafficking indicators because the Steel Riders had helped identify and report suspected trafficking situations 3 times in the past 2 years during their long-distance rides. What he saw in Emma Rodriguez's face and body language triggered every alarm his training and experience had installed. The girl was pale, undernourished, and showed visible fear responses including trembling hands, shallow breathing, and constant scanning of the diner entrance. Her clothing was wrong for the weather, too thin and too adult-styled for a child her age. She had bruising on her upper arm, partially visible beneath her sleeve, and she'd just disclosed sexual abuse while expressing fear for her mother's safety and her own. Bear's response was immediate and measured. He didn't react with visible anger that might scare the girl or alert whoever was with her. Instead, he leaned back slightly to appear less physically imposing and spoke in the calm voice he used with his own daughters. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Emma Rodriguez. I'm 12. We're going to Tulsa, but I don't think that's really where we're going because I heard him on the phone talking about delivering me somewhere, and I think he's going to... Okay, Emma, I need you to breathe for me. You did exactly the right thing by telling me. Where's your stepfather right now? Paying for gas. My mom's in the bathroom. He watches me all the time, but he didn't see me get up. Bear made eye contact with the other riders at his table. These were men he'd served with or ridden with for years, people he trusted, absolutely. His vice president, a former Army Ranger named Marcus Webb, was already pulling out his phone. His road captain, James Crash Anderson, had positioned himself to watch the diner entrance. The others had gone quietly alert, in the way trained veterans do when a situation shifts from casual to tactical. "Marcus is calling the police right now," Bear told Emma, "but I need you to do something for me. I need you to go back to your table and act normal until the police arrive. Can you do that?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "He has guns. If he figures out I told, he'll hurt my mom, or he'll leave and take me with him and you'll never find us." Bear understood the complications immediately. If Carl suspected anything and decided to run, they'd have a chase situation that could turn violent If he threatened Diane, they'd have a hostage scenario. The safest play was to keep everything calm and contained until law enforcement arrived with the authority and training to handle it properly. "And I'm not going to let him hurt you or your mom," Bear said with absolute conviction. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going back to your table. My friends and I are going to stay right here. When your stepfather comes back, we're just bikers having coffee. But if he tries to leave with you before the police arrive, we're going to have a problem with our van blocking the parking lot exit. You understand?" Emma nodded, wiping her eyes quickly. She started to turn away, then looked back at Bear with an expression that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "Thank you for believing me. Nobody else ever does." She walked back to her booth just as Diane emerged from the bathroom. Emma slid into her seat and picked up a menu, trying to look casual while her heart hammered against her ribs. Her mother sat across from her and said something about the bathroom being dirty. Emma nodded and pretended to read the menu while watching the entrance for Carl. At the biker's table, Marcus had 911 on the line and was providing precise information to the dispatcher: location, situation, description of the suspect and potential weapon, description of the victim and her mother. The dispatcher confirmed officers were en route, ETA 12 minutes. She instructed Marcus to stay on the line and not to engage the suspect unless absolutely necessary to prevent immediate harm. Carl Brennan walked back into the diner 4 minutes after Emma returned to her booth. He moved with the casual confidence of someone who believed he controlled every aspect of his environment, scanning the room with the practiced awareness of a man who'd spent time in places where situational awareness meant survival. His eyes passed over the biker's table without particular interest, categorizing them as road-worn travelers like everyone else at a truck stop diner at 10 p.m. on a Wednesday. He slid into the booth across from Diane and Emma, reaching for the coffee cup the waitress had left. Pump was slow. "We should eat fast and get back on the road. Want to make Tulsa by 3 a.m. Emma kept her eyes on her menu, willing her hands not to shake. Diane nodded absently and flagged down Sarah, the waitress, to order. Carl ordered a burger and fries. Diane asked for a salad, and Emma said she wasn't hungry. Carl's eyes narrowed slightly at that, and he reached across the table to grip Emma's wrist in a gesture that could have looked fatherly to anyone not watching closely. "You need to eat something, Emma. Order the chicken tenders. You like those." His fingers pressed hard enough to hurt, hard enough to remind her of his control. Emma ordered the chicken tenders in a voice that came out smaller than she'd intended. Carl smiled and released her wrist, leaving red marks that would fade to bruises by morning. At the corner table, Bear watched the interaction through peripheral vision while pretending to focus on his coffee. He saw the wrist grab, saw the girl's fear response, saw the way the mother seemed completely checked out and unaware of the dynamic happening 2 feet in front of her. Marcus still had 911 on the line, now updating the dispatcher on the suspect's return and current position. A white male, approximately 6'1", 190 pounds, wearing jeans and a black Carhartt jacket, Marcus spoke quietly. Seated in booth 7 with the victim and her mother, displaying controlling behavior toward the victim. No weapons visible, but victim reported guns in their vehicle. The dispatcher confirmed officers were 8 minutes out and requested that Marcus's group maintain visual contact without engaging unless the suspect attempted to leave with the victim. Bear had already positioned Crash near the door and had signaled Tommy Chen, their youngest member and a former army medic, to move his bike to block the parking lot exit under the pretense of checking his tire pressure. Sarah, the waitress, brought food to Emma's table, and Carl made small talk with her about road conditions and weather. He was good at seeming normal, at projecting the image of a regular stepfather on a family road trip. Sarah smiled politely and moved on to other tables, not noticing the way Emma pushed food around her plate without eating, or how Diane stared at nothing while mechanically forking lettuce into her mouth. The minutes stretched. 6 minutes until police arrival. Carl finished half his burger and checked his watch, a nervous gesture that Bear catalogued as potentially significant. 5 minutes. Carl pulled out his phone and sent a text message, his expression darkening at whatever response came back. 4 minutes. He stood abruptly. I'm going to check the van, make sure I locked it. You two finish eating. This was the moment Bear had been preparing for. If Carl went to the van and saw Tommy blocking the exit, he might realize something was wrong. If he decided to grab Emma and run, they'd have seconds to respond. Bear stood as well, stretching casually, and walked toward the restroom corridor that passed near the exit. Crash had already positioned himself in the doorway, apparently checking his phone, but actually creating a human obstacle between Carl and the parking lot. Carl noticed Crash blocking his path and said, "Excuse me," in a tone that carried an edge. Crash looked up from his phone with the blank expression of someone who hadn't been paying attention. "Oh, sorry, man. Just trying to get signal." He moved aside slowly, giving Carl space to pass, while also giving Bear time to reach the corridor, where he had a clear view of both the exit and Emma's booth. Carl pushed through the door into the parking lot, just as 2 Oklahoma Highway Patrol cruisers pulled into the lot with lights off, per the dispatcher's instruction to approach without alerting the suspect. Carl saw them immediately, and his body language changed. His hand moved toward his waistband. His stance shifted into something defensive and ready. The officers exited their vehicles with hands near their weapons, moving to flank positions. "Carl Brennan, we need to talk to you for a minute, sir. Keep your hands where we can see them." Inside the diner, Emma heard her stepfather's name called through the glass door and knew immediately what was happening. Relief and terror hit simultaneously. Diane looked up confused, starting to stand. "What's going on? Why are the police here?" Bear moved quickly back to Emma's booth, lowering himself to a crouch beside it so he was at the girl's eye level. "Emma, the police are talking to Carl right now. You and your mom are safe, but I need you to stay here with me for a few minutes while they sort things out, okay?" Diane's confusion was shifting toward panic. "What's happening? Why would the police want to talk to Carl? Emma, do you know what this is about?" The girl looked at her mother and started crying, all the fear and shame and desperate hope pouring out in heaving sobs. "Mom, he's been hurting me. At night when you're at work. He comes into my room and—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Diane's face showed that understanding was dawning, horrible and complete. "Oh my God. Oh Emma, oh my baby." Diane reached for her daughter, and Emma collapsed into her arms, both of them crying now, while Sarah the waitress hovered nearby, asking if she should call someone, and Bear quietly explained that police were already here and handling the situation. Outside, Carl was being placed in handcuffs after officers had discovered he had an outstanding warrant in Texas for failure to appear on previous assault charges. A search of his person revealed the gun he carried in his waistband. The van would be impounded and searched thoroughly, which would later reveal the second gun, methamphetamine packaged for distribution, and Carl's phone containing text messages that would prove crucial to a much larger investigation. Trooper Michelle Rodriguez, the senior officer on scene, came into the diner and approached Emma's booth. She'd been briefed en route about the situation and had already called for backup from the Criminal Investigation Division and Victim Services. She knelt beside the booth with the practiced gentleness of someone who'd worked sex crimes cases before. "Emma, I'm Trooper Rodriguez. You're very brave for telling those men what was happening. You did exactly the right thing. I know this is scary and confusing, but you and your mom are safe now. Carl is in custody, and he's not going to hurt you anymore." Emma nodded against her mother's shoulder, unable to speak. Diane was still processing, her face cycling through shock and guilt and protective fury. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. How did I not know?" Trooper Rodriguez had heard this from non-offending parents many times. "Predators are very good at hiding what they do and manipulating everyone around them. This is not your fault, ma'am. Right now, we need to focus on getting Emma medical attention and a forensic interview so we can make sure Carl never has the opportunity to hurt her or anyone else again. An ambulance arrived 18 minutes later, along with 2 detectives from the CID and a victim advocate from the Oklahoma Children's Advocacy Center. Emma was transported to the hospital for a sexual assault examination, accompanied by her mother and the advocate. Diane would later be interviewed separately about what she'd known or suspected. But initial assessments suggested she'd been genuinely unaware of the abuse, isolated by Carl's manipulation and her own economic dependence on him. Bear and his crew gave detailed statements to detectives, describing Emma's disclosure, their observations of Carl's behavior, and their actions to keep the situation contained until law enforcement arrived. Detective James Warren, who'd been working trafficking cases for 7 years, asked specific questions about the phone conversations Emma had overheard regarding delivery and the right age. "This matches patterns we've been tracking," Warren told Bear after taking his statement. "We've had intelligence suggesting someone's been recruiting girls in the Southwest and moving them to buyers in the Midwest. If Carl's phone and the van search give us what I think they will, your quick thinking might have broken open a case that's been cold for 2 years." The van search, conducted 3 hours later after a warrant was obtained, revealed evidence that exceeded even Warren's expectations. Carl's phone contained encrypted messages that, once cracked by FBI cyber forensics, showed communications with 6 other individuals about the purchase, sale, and transport of minors. Photographs of Emma taken without her knowledge. Photographs of 3 other girls, aged 10 to 14, that would later be matched to missing persons reports from Texas and New Mexico. A hidden compartment beneath the van's floor contained $23,000 in cash, 4 additional phones, and a ledger documenting transactions that appeared to represent payments for children. The FBI's Innocence Lost Task Force was called in immediately, and what had started as a local sexual abuse case expanded into a federal trafficking investigation spanning 5 states. Emma's forensic interview took place the following morning at the Children's Advocacy Center, conducted by a specially trained interviewer who helped her describe what had happened in detail sufficient for prosecution. The interview was recorded and would later serve as crucial evidence in Carl's trial. Emma described 6 months of escalating abuse, Carl's threats against her mother, and the conversations she'd overheard about delivering her to someone in Tulsa. "He said his friend would pay a lot of money for me because I was the right age and looked young," Emma told the interviewer. "And he said after that I'd go somewhere else and I wouldn't see my mom again. I didn't understand all of it, but I knew it was bad. That's why I talked to the biker at the diner. I thought it was my last chance." Medical evidence supported Emma's account. The examining physician documented physical findings consistent with chronic sexual abuse and provided testimony that would be devastating to any defense Carl's attorney might attempt. DNA evidence was collected that would later match Carl's profile. Removing any possibility of him claiming the abuse was fabricated. Diane Rodriguez was cleared of any knowing complicity after extensive investigation and interviews. Detectives determined she'd been working evening shifts during most of the abuse, that Carl had systematically isolated her from friends and family, and that she'd been financially dependent on him after he'd convinced her to quit her previous job. She was a victim of Carl's manipulation, not a co-conspirator, though she would carry the guilt of not seeing what was happening for the rest of her life. The FBI investigation that followed Emma Rodriguez's disclosure at the Riverside Diner unraveled a trafficking network that had operated across 5 states for nearly 6 years. Special Agent Lisa Chen, who led the Innocence Lost Task Force team assigned to the case, would later describe it as one of the most extensive domestic trafficking operations they'd disrupted in the Southwest region. Carl Brennan's phones, once forensically examined, revealed communications with 8 other individuals involved in recruiting, transporting, and selling minors. The encrypted messaging app he'd used was sophisticated enough that it had initially appeared to be routine text conversations about construction jobs and equipment sales. But FBI cyber specialists recognized code words that matched known trafficking terminology. Merchandise meant children. Delivery meant transport to buyers. Specifications referred to age, appearance, and other characteristics requested by purchasers. The 3 girls whose photographs were found in Carl's van were identified within 72 hours of the search. Melissa Chen, 11, had been reported missing from Albuquerque 4 months earlier. Her mother had filed a report saying Melissa disappeared while walking home from a friend's house, but investigators had initially suspected a runaway situation. Sofia Martinez, 13, had vanished from El Paso 6 weeks before Emma's rescue, last seen leaving her middle school. Kayla Thompson, 10, had been missing from Amarillo for 18 months, a case that had gone cold after initial investigations yielded no leads. Recovery operations began immediately. FBI teams coordinated with local law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions, using information from Carl's phone to identify locations where the girls might be held. Melissa was found in a trailer outside Oklahoma City, held by one of Carl's associates who was arrested during the raid. Sofia was recovered from a house in Wichita that appeared to be a way station, where girls were held before being moved to final buyers. Kayla's recovery took longer, requiring cooperation with authorities in Arkansas, where she'd been sold to a man who'd kept her imprisoned in a rural property for over a year. All 3 girls were severely traumatized but alive. Their testimonies, combined with Emma's account and the documentary evidence from Carl's phones and van, built a prosecution case that would eventually result in federal indictments of 11 individuals on charges including sex trafficking of minors, sexual exploitation of children, and conspiracy. Emma and Diane remained in protective custody for the first 2 weeks, while the investigation expanded and suspects were arrested. The Advocacy Center provided trauma therapy for Emma, who was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and required intensive treatment to process what she'd experienced. Diane participated in therapy as well, working through her guilt and learning to recognize manipulation tactics she'd missed. Bear Morrison and the Steel Riders maintained contact throughout the process, though they were careful not to overwhelm Emma or insert themselves inappropriately into her recovery. Bear visited once with his wife Sarah, bringing a care package and a letter from his own daughters who were close to Emma's age. The letter expressed how brave Emma was and how proud they were of her for speaking up. "You saved yourself," Bear told Emma during that visit. And because you were brave enough to ask for help, you saved 3 other girls who were trapped the same way you were. That took incredible courage." Emma was quiet for a moment before responding. "I was so scared you wouldn't believe me." "Adults usually don't believe kids about this stuff." Bear's expression hardened with anger, not directed at her, but at the truth of what she'd said. Any adult who doesn't believe a child reporting abuse isn't worth the air they breathe. You deserve to be believed the first time you tried to tell someone, not just when you got desperate enough to ask strangers at a truck stop. That comment prompted an important conversation with therapists about Emma's previous attempts to disclose the abuse. It emerged that she'd tried to tell her school counselor 2 months into Carl's abuse, but had been too frightened and ashamed to be explicit about what was happening. She'd said her stepfather made her uncomfortable, and she didn't like being alone with him. The counselor had noted the concern and suggested Emma's mother might want to have a talk with her about normal family adjustment issues after remarriage. The failure of that intervention haunted Emma's therapist, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, who specialized in child sexual abuse treatment. She used Emma's case in training presentations about the importance of recognizing indirect disclosures and understanding that children often cannot or will not provide explicit details during initial attempts to report abuse. Carl Brennan was indicted on 47 federal charges, including sex trafficking of a minor, production of child pornography, sexual exploitation of children, and conspiracy. He faced additional state charges in Oklahoma for sexual assault and kidnapping. His federal trial began 14 months after his arrest in May 2019 and lasted 9 days. Emma testified via closed-circuit television, sparing her from facing Carl in the courtroom. Her testimony was clear and detailed, describing the progression of abuse, Carl's threats, and the overheard conversations about selling her. Defense attorneys tried to suggest she'd misunderstood innocent interactions, but medical evidence and the testimony of the other recovered girls made that defense impossible to sustain. The other girls testified as well, each describing similar patterns of grooming, abuse, threats, and eventual sale or attempted sale to buyers. Melissa Chen described being held in the Oklahoma trailer for 3 months, told she'd be killed if she tried to escape. Sofia Martinez testified about being transported in Carl's van to multiple locations while he negotiated her sale. Kayla Thompson, the youngest, described 18 months of captivity and repeated abuse by the man who'd purchased her. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 47 federal counts. Carl showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, maintaining the same cold defiance he'd displayed throughout the trial. At sentencing 3 months later, federal judge Patricia Morrison imposed 5 consecutive life sentences plus 180 years, ensuring Carl would die in federal prison. "Mr. Brennan," Judge Morrison stated during sentencing, "you preyed on vulnerable children with calculated cruelty. You exploited your position as a stepfather to abuse a child who should have been able to trust you. You participated in a network that treated children as commodities to be bought and sold. The harm you've caused is immeasurable and permanent. Society requires that you never have the opportunity to harm another child." The other defendants in the trafficking network received sentences ranging from 25 years to life, with 3 accepting plea bargains in exchange for testimony against higher-level operators. The investigation ultimately identified and arrested 23 individuals across the network, though prosecutors believed additional participants remained unidentified. Emma's recovery continued over the following years. She remained in therapy through high school, working with Dr. Walsh to process her trauma and develop healthy coping mechanisms. Diane sold their house in El Paso and relocated to a different state, where they could start fresh without constant reminders of Carl. Mother and daughter worked to rebuild their relationship, which had been damaged by Emma's feelings of abandonment and Diane's guilt over not recognizing the abuse. By her 16th birthday in 2022, Emma had become an advocate for trafficking awareness and prevention. She spoke at conferences for law enforcement and child protection professionals, always keeping her identity protected, but sharing her story to illustrate how trafficking could happen to any child, and how critical it was for adults to believe children's disclosures. "I tried to tell people before that night at the diner," she said during one presentation, "but I didn't have the words, or I was too scared, or the adults I told didn't understand what I was really saying." We need to teach kids that it's okay to be explicit about what's happening to them, and we need to teach adults to ask direct questions and believe the answers even when they're horrible to hear. Bear Morrison attended one of Emma's presentations, sitting in the back of the room and feeling immense pride in how this terrified 12-year-old had transformed into a poised teenager, using her worst experience to help others. After the presentation, Emma saw him and immediately walked over for a hug. "I never properly thanked you," she said. "You and your friends saved my life that night. You believed me when I had no reason to think anyone would." Bear shook his head gently. "You saved yourself, Emma. You made the hardest decision of your life when you walked up to our table. We just did what any decent person should do when a child asks for help." The Steel Riders MC incorporated trafficking awareness training into their club activities, working with FBI contacts to learn recognition indicators and reporting procedures. They distributed informational materials at their charity events and partnered with advocacy organizations to support prevention programs. What had started as one girl's desperate disclosure at a truck stop diner had expanded into an ongoing commitment to protect vulnerable children. The Riverside Diner became an unexpected landmark in the story. Sarah, the waitress, who'd witnessed Emma's approach to the biker's table, started training all her staff on trafficking indicators and what to do if they suspected a customer was in danger. The diner's owner installed posters in the bathrooms with hotline numbers for trafficking victims and trained employees to watch for signs of control or coercion among customers. Federal trafficking statistics showed measurable impact from the network's disruption. The number of missing children cases in the Southwest region dropped by 18% in the year following the arrests, suggesting the network had been responsible for more cases than investigators had initially documented. Recovery of girls like Melissa, Sophia, and Kayla led to additional investigations that freed other victims and identified other perpetrators. Emma graduated high school in 2024 with plans to study criminal justice and eventually work in victim advocacy. She transformed her trauma into purpose, using her experience to fuel a determination to help other survivors navigate the legal system and recovery process. Diane supported her daughter's goals while managing her own ongoing therapy and her work with a non-profit that supported non-offending parents of abuse victims. The relationship between Emma and the Steel Riders remained strong years after that March night in 2018. Bear and his wife included Emma in their extended family, inviting her to graduation parties and holiday gatherings. The other riders stayed in touch, creating a support network that reminded Emma she was believed, valued, and protected. On the 6th anniversary of her rescue, Emma posted publicly for the first time about her experience, carefully protecting, identifying details, but sharing her story to encourage other victims to speak up. The post went viral, generating thousands of responses from survivors sharing their own stories and from people expressing support. One response came from Melissa Chen, now 17 and also an advocate for trafficking survivors. "You saved my life too," Melissa wrote. "Because you were brave enough to ask for help, the FBI found me 3 days later. I think about that all the time. How different things would be if you'd stayed silent." Emma's response captured the complexity of survival and advocacy. "I stayed silent for 6 months because I was terrified and ashamed and didn't think anyone would believe me. I only spoke up that night because I thought it was my last chance. We can't blame ourselves for the time we stayed quiet. We can only be proud of ourselves for the moment we found our voice." That wisdom, hard-earned through trauma and recovery, became central to Emma's advocacy work. She emphasized that victims shouldn't be held responsible for their own rescue, that the burden of stopping abuse belonged to perpetrators who committed it and adults who failed to recognize or respond to it. But she also celebrated the courage it took for any victim to disclose, regardless of how long they'd been silent first. Bear Morrison kept a photo in his wallet from Emma's high school graduation, her smile genuine and her eyes clear. He'd look at it sometimes and remember the terrified child who'd whispered her desperate plea at a truck stop diner. Then compare that memory to the strong young woman who'd turned her worst experience into a mission to help others. The Steel Riders continued their rides across the Southwest, always stopping at the Riverside Diner when passing through Oklahoma. Sarah, the waitress, would bring them coffee and pie, and they'd sit at the same corner table where Emma had approached them 6 years earlier. The booth had become something of a memorial, a reminder that sometimes the difference between tragedy and rescue was simply whether someone chose to believe a child and act on that belief. In the end, Emma Rodriguez's story wasn't just about a trafficking network disrupted or predators imprisoned. It was about a 12-year-old girl who trusted her instincts, found courage in desperation, and chose to believe that somewhere in a truck stop diner there might be adults who would help her. And it was about 6 bikers who heard that whispered plea and responded with immediate action that saved 4 children's lives and prevented countless future victims from falling into the same network's trap.